Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today's episode is going to be a deck tech from the wild. On episodes like these, I take you through a deck that I personally played against and found to be very interesting. Since these decks were made by others from the Commander community, they're not going to be following my budget restrictions. On this deck tech, I'm going to take you through its strategy, the tactics, and how this deck wins. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGplayer affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. So today's deck tech comes to you courtesy of Ben JESSEN, who's a friend of the show. Ben's got plenty of great decks, but the one that really sticks out to me is his Malfegor deck. Malfegor is a 6/6 flying demon dragon that costs 2 black, red. When Malfegor enters the battlefield, discard your hand. Each opponent sacrifices a creature for each card discarded this way. So Malfegor can be a one-sided board wipe, but at the cost of losing your hand. Ben had this to say about his deck. It actually started out as a madness deck, but the more I played it, the less I liked the madness aspect, so I slowly phased most of those cards out. One of the challenges in building the deck has been making sure it doesn't cross into the anti-fun territory, which is a territory I think discard decks definitely can tend to occupy. So while there are discard and discard payoff cards, I try to mostly focus on ones that affect everyone equally or just myself. I am constantly tweaking the deck. I think it has changed the most out of any of the decks that I have built. There's just so many different things you can do with it. I have a saying when it comes to this deck, it's not a matter of if I will discard my whole hand, it's a matter of when. So as Ben said, his deck is going to revolve around discard, but we're only going to be using discard spells that affect everyone equally or just ourselves. But discarding our whole hand isn't necessarily a bad thing. We're going to have plenty of ways to draw a couple cards each turn and might even benefit off of having no cards to start. So what's our strategy with this deck? We're going to go Hellbent and draw multiple cards each turn. Discarding your whole hand might be bad for most decks, but not for this one. And then how do we win with this deck? We're going to benefit from discarding or forcing opponents to discard. So with this deck, we can actually benefit from discarding, and we can hurt our opponents by doing it too. Our deck is built to run without a hand, but our opponents' decks won't be. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So let's start with tactic number 1, Dark Summonings. First up, we're going to be running Sol Ring, which costs 1 and taps for 2. Next up, there's Rakdos Signet, which costs 2, and we can pay 1 and 2 to tap for black-red. And then we're running 2 rituals with Dark Ritual and Cabal Ritual. Dark Ritual costs a black and adds black to our mana pool. And Cabal Ritual does the exact same thing, but if we have Threshold, it adds an extra black. With all the cards that we're going to discard, it's very likely that we have Threshold most of the time. Next up, there's Heartless Summoning, which doesn't ramp us, but it does help us reduce cost. It says creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast, but creatures you control get -1/-1. Since we're running a good amount of high-costed but very powerful creatures in this deck, this can come in handy. Another card that can really come in handy is Black Market. It says whenever a creature dies, put a charge counter on Black Market. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add black to your mana pool for each charge counter on Black Market. In this deck especially, this card can get out of control very quickly. So now that we've talked about ramping, let's talk about discarding. So it's time to move on to tactic number 2, discard, DAT-CARD. First up, there's Anger, which as long as it's in our graveyard and we control a mountain, creatures we control have haste. Like I mentioned before, we have a lot of big beaters in this deck, and giving them all haste can help us kill out of nowhere. Next up, there's Call to the Netherworld, which has Madness for 0, and it says return target black creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So by discarding this card, we can actually just cast it for free, and that's a lot of value. Some other Madness cards that we're running are Stormcrook Occultist, Bloodhall Priest, and From Under the Floorboards. Stormcrook Occultist has Trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we exile the top card of our library, and until the end of the turn, we can play that card. This kind of temporary card advantage can come in really handy for us. And then whenever Bloodhall Priest enters the battlefield or attacks, if we have no cards in hand, it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. And then From Under the Floorboards can make us a ton of zombies for just X black. Next up, there's Key to the City, which we can tap to discard a card, and up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. On top of that, whenever it becomes untapped, we can pay 2, and if we do, we draw a card. So this card can actually be another discard enabler for us. It can help us get one of our big threats through on top of replacing a card. And then there's Hazoret, which can't attack or block unless we have 1 or fewer cards in our hand. That's a very easy restriction for this deck to meet, especially since we can use her to discard cards too. And finally, there's Whip of Erebos, which helps us in multiple ways. First off, it gives all of our creatures lifelink, so that can be huge for this deck. And then by paying 2 black and tapping it, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, exile instead of putting it anywhere else, and activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So by discarding one of our big creatures, we can actually just cheat it into play with this. And this card can actually really help us stabilize with that lifelink too. But after talking about discarding, let's talk about ways to replace those cards. So now let's move on to tactic number 3, Free refills. First up, there's Bag of Holding, which says whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard. We can pay 2 and tap it to loot, or we can pay 4 and tap it to sacrifice it and return all cards exiled with it back to our hand. So this can provide us an insane amount of value all at once. Getting everything back that we've discarded can set up a huge turn. And then there's Deadeye Tracker, which we can pay 1 and a black to tap it and exile 2 cards from an opponent's graveyard, and then it explores. So this can be graveyard removal on top of card advantage. And then when Bomat Courier attacks, we exile the top card of our library face down. By paying a red, discarding our hand, and sacrificing the courier, we can put all the cards exiled with it into our hand. Next up, there's Blood Scrivener, which really benefits us from being Hellbent. It says if you would draw a card while no cards are in your hand, instead you draw 2 cards and lose 1 life. 1 life is a very small price to pay for 2 cards. And then Asylum Visitor has Madness, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So this can even benefit us from our opponents being Hellbent too. Next up, there's Crafted Skullcap and Avaricious Dragon, which do the exact same thing. They have at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card, but at the beginning of your end step, you discard your hand. Now, most decks won't make that trade-off, but we definitely will. And then Sarkhan does this in an even bigger way if we can make him ultimate. His -6 says you get an emblem with at the beginning of your draw step, draw 2 additional cards, and at the beginning of your end step, discard your hand. Finally, the card that actually might draw us the most is Gearpoor Orrery. It says each player may play an additional land on each of their turns, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. So we do have to be careful with this though, because our opponents can benefit from it too. But if we're set up correctly, this can be a fantastic card in this deck. But we're not quite done with our draw engines just yet. So let's go through some that don't depend on us being Hellbent in tactic number 4, Efficient Engines. First up, there's Phyrexian Arena, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose a life. This can provide a ton of card advantage for us very early. And then there's Outpost Siege, which is a great temporary card advantage engine. By choosing cons, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library, and until the end of your turn, you may play that card. A similar one to this is Theater of Horrors, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. During your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. This deck isn't short on ways to deal damage, so this is going to provide us a ton of value. And finally, there's Experimental Frenzy, which says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library, but you can't play cards from your hand. And then by paying 3 in a red, you can destroy Experimental Frenzy. So having no cards in our hand really doesn't hurt us when this is in play. And as long as we're not hitting lands, we can get a ton of value with this. But outside of engines, we also want some ways to get a ton of cards back at once. So now let's move on to tactic number 5, Wheel and Deal. First up, there's Reforge the Soul, which has a miracle cost for 1 in a red, and it says each player discards his or her hand, then draws 7 cards. Magus of the Wheel does the exact same thing, but we have to pay 1 in a red and tap it and sacrifice him to do so. So these cards can get us a brand new hand no matter how many cards we discard. And these cards can be extremely deadly if we're set up correctly. Wheel of Fate does the exact same thing, but we have to wait for a bit since it has to spend 4 for 1 in a red. Regardless, once this goes off, it can provide us a ton of value and be detrimental to our opponents. And finally, there's Dark Deal, which says each player discards all the cards in their hand and then draws that many cards -1. As I mentioned before, if we're set up correctly, this can be an absolutely game-ending card. Because with this deck, the more cards our opponents discard, the better. So outside of wheeling, we've got other ways to make people discard too. So let's move on to tactic number 6, All Gone. First up, there's Siphon Mine, which makes each other player discard a card, and we draw a card for each card discarded this way. So most of the time, for just 4 mana, we're drawing 3 cards and making each other player discard 1. And then there's Mind Slicer, which is a very brutal card against a lot of decks. Because when it dies, each player discards their entire hand. Again, our deck is built to recover from having no hand, but most decks aren't. So another card like Sire of Insanity can come in really big for us too. It says at the beginning of each end step, each player discards their hand. So as long as this is in play, not one player will get to hang on to cards. And Painful Conjurer can be an especially brutal card as well. It says whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. That's a very high price to pay and one that they might not even be able to do if they don't have a hand. Next up, there's Ill-Gotten Gains, which makes each player discard their hand, then return up to 3 cards from their graveyard to their hand. So not only does this force discard, but can actually get us back some key pieces. And finally, there's Past in Flame, which can also get us back some key pieces in a different way. It says each instant sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost, and on top of that, this has a flashback cost for 4 in a red. So it can essentially turn our graveyard into another temporary resource. But on top of dealing with our opponent's hands, we've got plenty of ways dealing with their boards too. Let's go through them now in tactic number 7, Bend and Break. First up, there's Rakdos Charm, which says choose 1. We can exile all cards from target player's graveyard, destroy target artifact, or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. Each of these can be great options in Commander and can come in really handy. A Rakdos Charm can deal with 1 artifact, Bandle Blast can deal with them all. It says destroy target artifact you don't control, and it's got an overload cost of 4 in a red. Just 5 mana for getting rid of all of our opponent's artifacts is huge. And then there's Terminate, which is a very efficient spell. It says destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. But perhaps a more efficient way of dealing with all creatures at once is Blasphemous Act. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, and it deals 13 damage to each creature. So most of the time, this is a 1 mana board wipe that very few creatures can survive. And finally, there's Null Brooch, which we can pay 2 to tap and discard our hand to counter target non-creature spell. This can be a fantastic card in this deck because, again, discarding our hand is no big deal. This can be especially effective after we've already discarded our hand with something like our commander. And as always, remember that our commander is a fantastic way to remove a lot of creatures at once. But our commander is definitely not the only demon out there. So now let's move on to tactic number 8, absolutely demonic. First up, there's Blood Speaker, which isn't a demon, but it can help us find them. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice Blood Speaker. If you do, search your library for a demon card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And whenever a demon comes into play under our control, we can return Blood Speaker from our graveyard to our hand. So this is a fantastic, repeatable tutor for demons. And two of those demons that we can search for are Rakdos, Lord of Riots, and Rakdos, the Showstopper. We can't cast Rakdos, Lord of Riots, unless an opponent lost life this turn. And it also has creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1 life your opponent's lost this turn. This deck can be great at dealing out a ton of damage in a turn, so this can come in huge. And then when Rakdos the Showstopper enters the battlefield, we flip a coin for each creature that isn't a demon, devil, or imp, and we destroy each creature whose coin comes up tails. So while this is slightly random, it can be extremely one-sided and very effective. We've even got some demons that can provide us card advantage with Harvester of Souls and Villainous Broker of Blood. Harvester of Souls says whenever another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. And Villainous Broker of Blood says whenever you lose life, draw that many cards. Some other demons that can help us with card advantage are Bloodgift Demon and Demon Lord Belzenlock. Bloodgift Demon says at the beginning of your upkeep, target player draws a card and loses 1 life. Now we don't always have to target ourselves, so this can actually be a card that can finish off our opponents in the right situation. And then Demon Lord Belzenlock says when it enters the battlefield, we exile cards from the top of our library until we exile a non-land card, and then we put that card into our hand. If the card's converted mana cost is 4 or greater, we repeat this process. And then Demon Lord Belzenlock deals 1 damage to us for each card put into our hand this way. So this has the potential to deal us a lot of damage, but also draw us a ton of cards, so it's well worth it. Next up, there's Runescar Demon, which is essentially a tutor on a body. When it enters the battlefield, we search our library for a card, put that card into our hand, and shuffle our library. And finally, there's Sower of Discord, and when it comes into play, we choose 2 players. Whenever damage is dealt to one of the chosen players, the other chosen player also loses that much life. This can be an absolutely brutal card. It can help us really finish off a player quickly. These demons are incredibly powerful, can really help us win the game. But we've got other ways to win the game outside of attacking with some demons. So let's go through those ways now in tactic number 9, Silver Lining. First up, there's Liliana's Contract, which when it enters the battlefield, we draw 4 cards and lose 4 life. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 or more demons with different names, you win the game. So we don't even have to attack with our demons, this can just win us the game for us. But if we do want to attack with our demons, our Golden Pig can easily help us get them through. Our Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Archfiend of Ifnir. It's a 5/4 flying demon with cycling 2 and it costs 3 black. It says whenever you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. This deck is extremely effective at discarding a ton of cards at once. Once we're set up with this in play, it makes it nearly impossible for our opponents to keep any creatures on the board. If this isn't dealt with, it can be absolutely game ending and let us get through easily with all of our creatures. And on top of that, as a 5/4 flyer itself, it's a pretty good threat. Also, don't ignore the fact that it can cycle for 2. There are situations where that can really come in clutch if you're not set up for this. It's overall just a very effective card and works extremely well in this deck. And that's what makes it the Golden Pig. Another great card for this deck though is Bone Miser. Bone Miser says whenever you discard a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever you discard a land card, add black. And whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, draw a card. So this can provide us an insane amount of value for whatever we're discarding from our hand. And with Faith of the Devoted in play, we can actually drain our opponents with those discarded cards too. It says whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So not only can this keep us alive, but can also be a fantastic finisher too. Now we've talked about ways from benefiting from us discarding, but what about benefiting from our opponents discarding too? So it's time for us to move on to our final tactic, tactic number 10, Down and Out. First up, there's Sangromancer, which says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may gain 3 life, and whenever an opponent discards a card, you may gain 3 life. This deck is great at killing creatures and forcing discards, so this is going to gain us a lot of life. Next up, there's Waste Not, which is essentially a reverse Bone Miser for our opponents. So we get those same benefits, but whenever our opponents discard instead of us. And then Guest Grimoire says whenever an opponent discards a card from their hand, you may draw a card. With this in play, it pretty much only takes 1 wheel for this to provide an incredible amount of value and to keep us going. And if we do wheel, we've got something like Fate Unraveler to hurt them too. It says whenever an opponent draws a card, Fate Unraveler deals 1 damage to that player. So this can deal a ton of damage to our opponents throughout the game or all at once. And finally, we've got Megrim, which says whenever an opponent discards a card, Megrim deals 2 damage to that player. Hellspectre essentially does the exact same thing, but it's losing 2 life instead of 2 damage. On top of that, when it comes into play, we can force one of our opponents to discard a card. Regardless, both these can be fantastic finishers in this deck. Again, a big thank you to Ben for letting me share your deck with the community. This deck can be really powerful, can easily take over a game once it's set up. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, there's Command Tower, which can tap for any of our colors. Next up, there's Bojuka Bog, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, and we can tap it for a black. And then we've got 2 cycling lands with Barren Moor and Desert of the Glorified. Next up are the red cycling lands with Forgotten Cave and Desert of the Fervent. And then Rakdos Guildgate enters the battlefield tapped and taps for a black or a red. Next up, there's Rick's Mahdi Dungeon Palace, which we can tap for colors, or we can pay 1 black, red, and tap in, and each player discards a card, but we can only play that ability anytime we could play a sorcery. Finally, we've got 30 basic lands, 16 of those are swamps, and 14 are mountains. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGplayer optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. Bent's Malfegor deck comes in at $113.55. Again, the price of this deck is the price that I got for it on the day that I'm recording. If you want to see a breakdown of this deck's cost, check out the link in the description. Keep in mind that prices can and will fluctuate and change over time, but with these deck costs I want to be as transparent as I possibly can. Because this deck is slightly out of my budget range, let's talk about some budget cuts that we can use to make it cheaper. The cards that I'm going to be cutting are very powerful, but they're also pretty expensive compared to the others. Keep in mind that these are just my opinions on what cards to cut and to put in. First up, we're going to take out Black Market and put in Star Compass. Next up, let's take out Phyrexian Arena and put in Runeborn Hellkite. And then we're going to take out Past in Flames and put in Corvus Fury. Next up, we're removing Runescarred Demon and putting in Razakast Rite. And then let's take out Mind Slicer and put in Bottomless Pit. Finally, we're taking out Painful Quandary and putting in Creeping Dread. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this deck tech are. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget Commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.